Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation on fusing and embedding data analytics with FME, Snowflake, and Sisense. What we're hoping to show in today's presentation is how you can fuse data from multiple different source systems around your organization and embed that into analytics to help your end users, your citizens, your customers, be able to make informed decisions based on that data. Presenting with me today is Gavin Park. Gavin is our lead solutions consultant here at IMGS, and Gavin has over 20 years experience in the GIS and data industry. Gavin's also a certified FME trainer, desktop professional and server professional. I'm Gareth Cronin. I'm the commercial manager here at IMGS. I don't have as many fancy titles as Gavin, but I do have over a decade's experience on the commercial side, helping organizations achieve their goals. In terms of today's attractions or our agenda, I'm going to give a brief overview of IMGS, who we are, to kind of put into context. Safe kind of prompted us to kind of put in some interesting facts around data. And anybody who follows me on LinkedIn knows that I love my Fun Fact Fridays. So I've pulled some interesting facts around data, and that's to set the scene around when we speak about this kind of explosion of data in our modern world. I'm going to give a quick technology overview. So I'm going to talk about the solutions in isolation as technologies, and then Gavin's going to speak about how we brought these technologies together to build a solution to solve real-world problems in organizations. We're then going to give a summary, and then we'll be over in the live Q&A if you have any questions for us. So IMGS, who are we? This is our 19th year in business, and we mainly operate here in Ireland, but we do have a global presence and customers dotted around the globe. At our core, we help companies automate, visualize, and power data insights. And we do that for a wide variety of customers, from local authorities, government agencies, utilities, communications companies, defense, and also some private industry as well. So data in 2020. Every second, 1.7 megabytes of data is created by every person. Every minute, nearly 60,000 photos are uploaded to Instagram, and every hour, 21 million tweets are posted to Twitter. This was a staggering one for me when I researched it, but every day 306.4 billion emails are sent, which is just an absolute staggering number considering the population of the globe is only roughly about 7 odd billion, or I don't think we're that high yet. And it's estimated that at the end of 2020, our digital universe is 44 zettabytes or zettabytes, depending on where you live in the world, of data, which is massive. I actually had to Google it, and it was 44 trillion gigabytes. So Gavin and I, when we were preparing for this, we're trying to, how do you take such a vast number and try kind of put it into context? So we did a bit of Googling, did a bit of maths, and roughly if every gigabyte was a dollar bill and you stacked them on top of each other, they would stretch from the Earth up to the moon and back roughly about 178 times, which I don't even think does it justice in terms of the actual volume of data that we're speaking about here. But I think it sets the scene nicely about what we're going to speak about later on. It's also mentioned that data is the new oil, and I'd argue that I think with oil it can only be consumed once, where with data, the more you consume it, the more valuable it becomes. The more data sets you bring together to analyze also makes it more valuable. So I definitely think it's far beyond the value of even oil or gold. In terms of the technologies we're going to show today, these are just some of them. So we're going to speak about Safe Software, the reason we're all here today, which is their enterprise ETL platform, FME. We're also going to showcase a bit of Snowflake, which is a cloud data platform, and then Sisense, which is a business intelligence data platform. I have a short slide on each of them just to kind of put into context in case you're new to any of these technologies. So FME, as I mentioned already, is that enterprise ETL platform that allows you to connect to multiple different data sources, whether they be on-premise, in the cloud, or through an API or an IoT device, whatever it may be, and pull that information in. Then when you have it, you can then transform that data, whether it's from a geospatial context in terms of reprojection, or it could be just from a general data standpoint in terms of validating that data and making sure that it's right for your organization. Then that data can then be pushed to an endpoint, whether it's a business intelligence platform, a report, or a very simple reprojection of an actual existing file format. And most importantly, when you hark back to that previous slide around the kind of volumes of data that's out there, it's that ability to be able to automate your workflows. So to have these processes in place that will take that data, apply your business rules, and then push it to its destination. Snowflake, which is going from strength to strength at the moment is our cloud data warehouse, or sorry, is our cloud data platform, and it allows you to ingest both structured and unstructured data, and consume it in this one single repository or source of truth. And then from there, you can create data warehouses, data lakes, provide data exchanges, an output for data applications, or perform data science tasks, with the ultimate goal that then that data will be consumed in an endpoint somewhere, whether that would be through a business intelligence platform or a report, or another application, for example. And then finally, Sisense. Sisense is our business intelligence platform, and that allows you to take in this data, and I suppose start to visualize it for your organization in multiple different ways, by not only infusing or fusing the data, so by taking it around from different points in the organization and putting it into other existing applications internally, or then embedding that. So again, if you have a piece of software yourself or an application you've created yourself, you can embed that analytic into that and fully brand it as your own, and be able to provide that to your citizens or your customers, for them to be able to consume that information. And Gavin's going to speak about all these a little bit more later on. And I touched on it there, but this is what we mean, I guess, by infused and embedded. And I can just a bit of clarity, because I know there's a lot of jargon out there. So when we speak about infused data analytics, that's where you're driving, I suppose, better decisions internally by taking this data together, and putting it into your workflows or your processes for maybe internal users to be able to kind of consume that information. And then when we speak about embedded, it's about taking that same information and embedding it into an existing application that you have, or on a website, or something that external people would be able to consume. Now, these terms are interchangeable depending on your organization and your business needs. So again, you might even use embedded internally as well, which is absolutely fine, but it's just for the sake of this presentation, this is how we've kind of separated them out. And then the final piece for me before I hand over to Gavin is just an overview of all the technologies that we're going to be kind of speaking about today, which we then kind of bring together to kind of build a solution. And so you'll see very prominently in the center is FME, and that's that, as I mentioned, ETL platform in the center that's pushing and pulling that information out to these different source systems, whether it's cloud like AWS or Azure, or whether it's applications like Office 365, which has just gained huge momentum over the last year or two, given our current circumstances. Snowflake, which we're going to discuss later on, and Sisense, and how you can kind of bring all that together to build a solution that may look quite complicated here, but we'll actually show you how simple it is in terms of how seamless all of these kind of work together. So I'm going to hand over to Gavin, who is going to talk about our core integrations.
Cool, thank you. So the three things we wanted to touch on today were really how we can drive the data analytics process with FME. So FME is a really, really good orchestration tool. So there's a lot there that we can do to actually drive the process, the data management, actually power some of the analytics behind the scenes to actually then surface that up into a sort of dashboarding technology and those analytics that Garrett's referred to. But also then, how do we start to make that a little bit smarter? So how do we get people to respond to that information that's being presented to them? And obviously then again, we can use that sort of orchestration capability within FME to actually start to make decisions and to trigger actions based on the information people are seeing. So it's no longer just kind of a nice pretty dashboard that everybody looks at and then forgets 2 seconds later. You can actually do some decision making based on the information you're seeing there and then. And then lastly, we just want to look at how do we infuse all that analytic capability into FME? So, taking some of that capability that already exists out there and enriching kind of the workflows we're building with FME, some of the reporting we're doing with FME, to make it a lot easier for some of those outputs for people to see and make decisions on as we run through. So the first bit we just want to mention is really just the managing data with FME. So we've mentioned the Snowflake database. And when it comes to data management, that's probably the unsung hero bit. It's the bit that FME does every day across the world, moving data around between different systems. And we're not really probably going to touch too much on it when we go through this, because it just sits there in the background. FME's getting data into the data warehouses, the data marts, pushing it through and out. You don't really see that as part of the process. So we just wanted to briefly highlight some of the capabilities there and things we're doing. This doesn't always come out through some of the actual other workflows. So it just means FME can keep your data centrally stored. It can keep everything synced up. It's where you can bring everything together. And obviously now with data exploding and having lots more data, especially with sensors, that really plays into the cloud type solutions. So we can store large volumes of data very, very scalably and actually automate and synchronize all of that data very, very simply with the tools we have. And it just works. And that's one big thing, certainly with the Snowflake database. When we're putting data in there, it's scaling really, really easily with minimal effort, and it's just working behind the scenes. So we don't really have to worry too much about it. So it just lets us stage records locally, so we can pull data down, and then we can push that up into the data marts. We can then schedule the synchronization, so we can move data around, and it's really that integration capability. So we can take data from a disparate number of different data sources, run them through FME, do some data validation, or just translate one particular sensor schema into a common data model centrally. So that once all that data goes into the Snowflake database, it's there ready for the analytical capabilities, the Sisense dashboards, just to sit on top and start serving that content out nice and simply. And there's new geospatial capabilities for Snowflake that's come through in the last release of FME, and it's really, really simple. So in the example here, we have a bike scheme in Dublin where you can basically go and hire a bike for an hour, cycle it around and drop it off. And that's got sensors on every single one of the sites they have across the Dublin area. That tells you how many bikes are available and things. So it's generating a lot of content, a lot of information. So obviously that's been running for a number of years. So we wanted to get all of that data into this data repository so we can start to actually look at it, look at some of the patterns that were going on around it. So, we can just simply take FME, point that at the data, and then we can pump that data up into our Snowflake database, turning it into spatial information at the same time. It's no longer just a straight latitude and longitude. It's becoming a geometry object as we go up there as well as part of our process. And you can see there, we took about just under 27 million records and pushed that up. And, it's really simple. You just stick the CSV reader in, you put the database reader in, and that data moves up. And we can quite quickly start to load that content into that platform. As we go, it becomes spatially enabled. So we've got all of our geometry features, so we can start to see where those sensors sit around the area. But obviously that gives us all of the background data. So that's fine. That gives us all the previous year's one. But actually those sensors are out there. They're reporting all of the time. So we want to keep the data up to date. So we can use the new sensor sort of streaming capabilities within FME, building these data streams to constantly listen to those sensors that are out there and continuously update that data warehouse with all the latest information. So we can use it as a bulk upload to get the historic information in, and then we're using the streaming capabilities to keep the sort of current sensor information coming through, keeping that data live and fresh as we run through. And I say it's always been a real unsung hero in FME with the sensors or the streaming capability, but I think that explosion of sensors now, the refreshed interface just makes it so much easier to actually start to bring that data in and actually sort of power some of these new streaming type workflows. And obviously then we're going to put this into Sisense for the dashboarding and sort of the data intelligence side of it. So we can look at some more of the traditional dashboard sides, and then we'll look at some of the sort of smarter analytics we can start to do and smarter workflows we can build out from them. And it just gives us a way of visualizing all of that information. If there's 27, 28 million record points, that's very hard to see in a SQL context. It's not very pretty. When we start to actually pull it into these dashboarding environments, you can start to quickly see what's going on with your data and some of the patterns and things that are there, and actually then start to make decisions based on that information. So the first one we were having a look at was a customer approached us about their low voltage distribution network, which in more simple terms is basically those wooden poles you see out and about in the countryside that carry the electrical network from the distribution centers out to your house. There's an awful lot of those wooden poles floating around, and people just tend to forget them. But also they have to be maintained, and there's quite a lot of effort that goes into maintaining those distribution networks. So we came up and had a look around, and somebody actually came up with some numbers. They did some calculations on this, and if you take an 1,000-mile low voltage distribution network, which is the LV network, assuming that each pole is about 250 feet apart, that's going to give you roughly 21,000 poles. And if you're inspecting just 12% of those every 10 years, and it's costing about $100, they worked out, inspect each pole, that's going to be about a 25K a year inspection budget. So, it's a reasonable size amount of money for that kind of scenario. But if you start to scale that up to an Irish level and start to look at Ireland, ESB has 2.1 million wooden poles across Ireland, covering about 150,000 kilometres of those overhead lines. They're importing 15,000 wooden poles per year, and it's costing them €600 per pole to do that. So you can start to see, that's quite a large amount of money already just in those poles coming through. But actually then their worst served customer metric, which is basically those customers who are unfortunate to lose their network, several times a year, 56% of those customers are impacted basically because of bad weather. You can imagine that west coast of Ireland, that's where all the bad weather comes from. It's straight across the Atlantic. It comes straight in. A lot of those storms are going to hit. If your poles aren't very good, they're going to come down, and that starts to impact those metrics. And it will also impact the customer minutes lost metric. So you can see it's currently in 2019 at 87.47 minutes. And that's basically what a distributor of electricity will be monitored on in the UK and Ireland. And if that number goes over certain levels, it's a KPI, then there's sort of financial impacts in terms of the generator and the government actually charging the providers or fining the providers for not meeting certain service level standards. So you can see, based on the previous metrics, to inspect that sort of network in Ireland is going to cost about €21 million just to do 10% of it every 10 years. So you're looking at a budget of about €2 million per year just to maintain and inspect that. So, what they want to know is, how can we do that better? How can we do that smarter? How can we use the analytics, all of the data we have coming in, to actually make, a better decision around our network and our infrastructure?
And just a 1 or a 2% impact on that number is huge. It's in the hundreds of thousands, which is phenomenal long term. I don't like the fact that you alluded to that we have bad weather in Ireland. I have the sun is always shining here. I don't know what you're talking about, Gavin.
I was going to say, I've never been to Ireland and it will not be sunny.
Yeah, that's true. Absolutely.
So really what we started to do is look at, where are those poles located? What health and what state are those poles already in? And actually, can we use FME to drive a little bit of machine learning to say, well, okay, it's fine to know where the poles are and to have a certain amount of information about them. But actually, what you really want to be able to do is to start to quantify that, to say, are those poles in a healthy state, an unhealthy state, and start to actually predict some of that asset failure, to say, well, if we know that a certain number of these poles are in a poor condition, they're the ones we want to focus on. There's no point going out and inspecting all the poles that are in a good condition, have only been replaced in the last couple of years. So essentially, we came up with a very simple dashboard that takes all of that information that's stored in the underlying Snowflake database, starts to apply some basic kind of rules to then generate an asset health. So it starts to use a little bit of machine learning to say, well, if it meets a certain number of criteria, we're going to categorize that as being, very, very healthy or very unhealthy, and score those assets basically between like a 1 and a 5 number. And you can see there that a reasonable number of the assets are in a decent state, but there's a reasonable chunk there as well that are probably starting to get towards their end of life, are probably at a greater risk from something going wrong or a weather event coming through as it runs through. But one of the key things is not just being able to predict what happens with those poles as the data runs through. Obviously they're going to age over time. The older the poles, it's more likely to fail. But what about all the non-uniform decay, which is basically the big weather impacts? What happens when they come along and actually start to hit the poles? Are they going to have a greater impact in terms of causing greater degradation than maybe it would be just over a straight aging process, for example? So we want to start to be able to pull in that weather information to actually then drive that machine learning algorithm to then start to predict which of those poles are more likely to fail based on the forecast information. So what we can do is we can use FME. We can read in, obviously, all the location of the poles. It's nice and simple. We can pull that in from Snowflake, but then we can start to talk to Met Éireann, which is the Irish Weather Service, and start to get the weather information for those poles' location. So we can say, well, what's the weather currently like at that particular pole, but also what's the forecast going to be? So we can pull all that weather data in, we can pull the forecast information in, again, put that into the data warehouse, but we can also then use that within FME to start to actually make some decisions around that logic as well. So here we're actually just using the Python caller, and for each pole, we're just checking to say, well, okay, what's its current health? What's the forecast, weather forecast going to be? And then taking that information, it's run through a little bit of machine learning logic that starts to say, well, based on a set of known behaviors, if we have this type of weather forecast, and we know that this pole is in this state, then what will happen to that pole based on that weather event? Is it more likely to fail based on the weather, or is it actually going to be fine and there's going to be very little impact on it because we know that pole's quite healthy, and a bit of wind that's forecast isn't then going to impact that pole health. So it's just being able to use all of those Python libraries, bring them into FME, and it just checks for each of those poles as it runs through, generates the data, and then we can push that algorithm and that analytics out back into the database so that that can then be visualized within the dashboards. So you can see here, we've got a weather event coming through. There's a storm, obviously comes normally in from the west coast and then across to the island. And we can start to then look through and say, well, okay, we know that around Dublin, weather's not going to be that bad. Therefore, a lot of the pole health is quite good. That network may be quite new, for example. But we can start to see that as we come in, there's going to be quite a number of areas where that's going to be hit quite heavily as it runs through in terms of some of the weather conditions. And that's going to change the poles or likely impact on them. So it might be that we're going to have a number of poles that are going to fail, or potentially going to fail, and therefore we actually want to get out and inspect those early, maybe replace those, be quite proactive about it. Therefore, they aren't likely to fail, and therefore our customer minutes won't be impacted because we aren't going to start cutting customers off. Especially in those more remote areas, losing your electricity can be a lot more problematic there than it can be, if maybe you're in the city centre or something as you go. And you can see here from the poles we've got through, there's a number that have been identified as having serious defects. Some of those have been notified or realized from the survey, but there's a number there you can see that are highlighted that have come from that predicted source. So that's that machine learning, flagging those poles within the data, within the FME workflow. So when the user comes in, they can start to see that that particular pole, number 163, is based on the predictions for the forecast information, is more likely to fail than the other poles. So they're probably the ones out of that list we actually want to start sending the engineers out to inspect, maybe look at replacing those ones as well as part of that process. So the idea is that you can identify those. We can generate, again, a work order with FME to say once we've checked those poles, we now understand which ones are likely to fail, which ones therefore need some maintenance. So we could put a work order into the system to dispatch an engineer or an engineering team to go out, and they can actually then start to look at replacing those poles, or at least assessing whether that pole needs replacing and having the kit on hand to replace it if it does when they're in the field. So it means they can be much more targeted about it. It means they can target the high-risk assets. So rather than wasting their time on assets that they know are in good health, they can actually start to target the ones that are at risk, spend that money a little bit more wisely, and then hopefully they'll get those customer minutes, those disconnection times down. And the idea is that this can all be done before the storm hits. You don't want to have an engineer out when it's gusting high winds, chucking it down with rain. They really don't like that. You want to be able to fix these before that happens. So if you've got that forecast, you have that forecast information coming through, you can be ahead of basically the storm. And you can make sure those decisions are made, the assets are fixed. So when the storm does hit, everything's in a healthy state and nothing should be impacted. And FME is always watching. Again, we're talking about the database sitting in the background, not really being seen. That's very much the same with FME automations. We can build these workflows and people just forget about them. It just works. And FME is really, really strong in terms of that just working, sitting in the background, just getting the job done all of the time and being able to run through. So in this case, we're just having a simple automation that every day checks the weather forecast, or every half day with the forecasts are updated, pulls that weather information down, runs the pole modeling, does any alerting that it needs to do, and sends out those alerts to the systems downstream to actually trigger that. And it just runs in the background, collecting all of that information. And the other part of it is really how we can then start to make the decisions from the dashboarding. So how can we start to say, well, okay, that's fine, but what if when I'm reviewing that information on the dashboard, I actually want to make some decisions about that. Maybe I want to trigger action. I look at something and think, well, based on my own experience, I think that poll's more likely to fail than this one over here, or these ones are more critical because we know there's something going on in this particular area that's making that more sensitive. That human intuition side of things is still very, very key. And obviously the analytics are really just helping humans make those decisions quicker and smarter, as well as part of it. Human logic still tends to be very powerful. So part of what we can do is we can actually start to embed capability into those dashboarding. So the Sisense platform has something it calls blocks. Blocks is really just a way of embedding HTMLs or JSON code into a dashboard that you can interact with. And that obviously opens up an awful lot of opportunity for FME, because FME is very, very good at generating those sorts of data sets and working with those sorts of data. So we can actually start to link FME up into the dashboard directly so that users can look at the dashboard and then make some decisions as they go. So what you can see here is two of those blocks, and they're both basically being driven by FME in slightly different ways. So we have a map on the right, and that map content is generated by FME. It's uploaded onto just an Azure data store, and then is linked out. So the little map client just brings down the GeoJSON that drives that map background. This was something we looked at for COVID, because obviously COVID's a hot topic this year and last year. So we can start to actually display a simple map with some thematics on there that people can look at. And on the left-hand side, we have a panel that's basically a simple web form, but that's really just sat on top of a webhook within FME. So a user can come in, they can enter the information there, and as they do that, that will push that information back into FME and into an FME workflow behind the scenes. So you can see here, the user's able to pan across the map. They can see a little bit of information. And obviously, we've just focused on the two FME components, but you've got the rest of the dashboard and all of the other kind of metrics around that as well. So the user can look at that. They can start to see all the information there. They can go, well, okay, based on what I can see, I want to put some actions in place. So in this case here, it's just doing PP allocation. So it's basically generating a work order that can get sent out that will then generate and allocate PP out to different organizations or different hospitals within that particular region. And again, once it's done that, it's a simple form, goes into an FME workflow. That FME workflow will look at that data, does some processing behind the scenes, and actually starts to raise the work orders and things that are behind the scenes as well, and then generates them. So you can see the information coming in here. So there's one created for each hospital, and that will say, it's going to allocate X amount of PPE based on the decisions that were made to that particular location and push them through. And these can be any systems. The beauty of FME is it's just talking to APIs. These are APIs behind the scenes. And again, we can actually then start to tell people. So in this case, we're pushing an email out. They can click through. They can then visualize the report. They can see what's happening. We could equally push this up onto SharePoint. So a lot of customers are using very similar workflows at the moment where we can upload data now onto SharePoint, and then anybody in the organization can see that. And obviously with everybody remote working, that's been hugely popular. Again, we can put a Teams message out to say, this new file's here. We can embed that in an email as it goes out. So people can get that information pushed to them. They're not having, again, to go to the dashboard to see that information. You can kind of see it a lot more closely to where you're actually interacting with it. So we've got a whole bunch of standard think metrics we can pull through again from different APIs to kind of enrich those reports. We obviously know where the dispatch locations are. So we have kind of where we need to send this data to all the different hospitals within the region. And we know where our depot starts. So again, we've got all of the route optimization kind of capabilities with FME, the route planning, the shortest pathfinder transformer, that we can actually then generate a route as well. So we can include that kind of optimized route delivery to say, well, you should really start here and then deliver to here and kind of work your way around with this one. So again, from quite a simple dashboard interface, we can actually drive quite a lot of processes, again, with FME, with all the tools and the functionality and the transformers that are there as part of this. And we can obviously use the web application here to then just deliver that up nice and easily as a kind of easily consumable metric. And again, just to show you that kind of running within the FME server environment, again, we've got automations. You can look at this one. So you can see the webhook there sits on the left, And then you can just see that workflow being built up across the screen. So the information comes in, we can process that order, we can process the information that's stored within the webhooks, and obviously then we can start to dispatch that through. And again, we can be quite clever with those messages as well as they come in. We can work out maybe if it's come from one certain application or another, we can then start to route those as well. We can be build up very rich automations. This one's nice and simple. It's fairly linear as we run across. We can start to then say we're going to look at our PPE dispatch based on the information there. We're going to raise a ticket into the ticketing system that's going to generate those actions. We're also going to send that report, a summary log, so that maybe people at a managerial level can start to see what's going on. And again, we can push that out with a Teams alert and things as we run through. And again, we sort of mentioned that the Snowflake capability sits there behind the scenes. Again, with this, we've got a nice simple automation that's just running on a schedule. We know the data gets refreshed every night, so we can run nightly, download all that latest data. We can process that data, put it into the right structure for our data mart, create maybe some simple summary tables. We're generating that GeoJSON that drives the map to the dashboard. And that just sits there in the background running through. And again, we're using Teams just as a simple error trapping. So if something goes wrong, we get a Teams message, because that means you can subscribe into that channel, more people can see it, and you're not filling your inbox up with potentially error messages and things as it runs through. But that's fine, so we can take all those actions. But at the same time, we can see from the reporting, FME's analytics is great in terms of the functionality, but possibly on some of the presentation side, it's not really up there with a lot of the dashboarding tools and things as we go. So, the HTML reports are very, very powerful. There's an awful lot you can do with them, certainly on the mapping side. But, the charting's not probably as rich as the likes of Sisense and some of the other kind of dashboarding technologies that sit there. They're very functional. They're probably not as deep. And they also don't allow us to really do any of the deeper kind of analytical machine learning type things as well that we can do on some of these platforms now. So what we can do is we can actually start to use some of the capabilities from vendors like Sisense to actually enrich that user experience. We can make it much more interactive. You can interact with the widgets. You can drill down into them, get a little bit more of an idea of what's going on. We can also start to introduce more of a narrative. So it's not just, here's a dashboard, here's a widget. We can actually get a sort of more human readable narrative that will explain some of the analytics that are being presented, that again, we can start to embed into other applications. And that's the nice thing with some of this, it's embeddable. And that's the really key part. It's not saying that now you have to go to dashboard A, dashboard B, system C, and over here again, we can actually take some of that logic, pull that through, and actually start to embed that into our FME workflow. So when we're sending out that HTML report, we can actually embed all of these analytics into that report as it goes, or embed it into an email that's being sent to a user as part of that process. So, it's much more targeted, it's much more fine-grained, and it's much more where the user needs to consume it, rather than just some amorphous dashboard that they have to remember to go and check. There's a nice simple developer's playground. So again, this is a very nice fit with FME. We can see we've got the little code snippets there. We can go in, we can see where we can get the widgets and things come through. So it gives us a very, very easy integration. It's actually doing exactly the same thing that the HTML report generator is doing behind the scenes for us in FME. So we can just replicate that same process and embed that directly into our FME transformers. And it's a very, very simple tweak to an existing FME workflow to actually bring that information in. So we've got that example code down the left, and that goes through into the transformers. So you can see we have our HTML report generator. We've got the standard image header. We've put a nice little map in, but we've also then just using the custom HTML. And that HTML you see there on the left, it's just loading in the Sisense JavaScript embed library. And then we've got some script that will then define our widgets. And that process is exactly the same as the chart generators using within the existing one. It's just, this is a custom piece of HTML because it's not natively supported by the HTML report generator, but functionally it's doing the same thing. So we can very, very easily just use a custom HTML, drop that little snippet of code in. We can add additional ones. We can put multiple different bits of those custom HTML codes and things in there for us. They're very much templated. So, once you've done it once, it's just copy, paste, replicate it as many times as you need it. And once you've done that, it means you can start to then generate these FME reports. So in this case, we're generating it for Dublin bikes. You can see there we've got nearly 21.7 million records coming through. And then we've just split this for basically 2019 and 2020 to show the difference in the pandemic. You can see here we've got 108 stations in 2019. We went up slightly to 110 by 2020. But what you'll notice is the actual number of stands dropped slightly. So we weren't really expecting, we thought we'd growth, especially with more stations. But actually, when you start to visualize or count the number of stands that are there, we've actually seen a little bit of a reduction in total capability. But we've also got our map, and we've tweaked the map slightly so that we can render both the stations that are present, but also the gold sort of colored ones are the top 10 stations. So we've worked out from the data where the busiest stations are, and obviously we can start to visualize those as well. And you can see here, just coming through, we've got St. Stephen's Green, which is the one that's in the centre of Dublin. It's the big tourist hotspot. You can see that's the most popular, which is probably fairly unsurprising. And then we have Charlemont Street, if I pronounced that right this time, which is kind of just a little bit out onto the side of, and it's near the Lewis. So you can imagine people are coming in for work. They can walk down the street from the Lewis station, hire a bike, and then bike into town.
The Lewis is our city tram, just for a bit of context.
Sorry, yeah. And then looking at St. Stephen's Green, you'll notice there's a number of different stations there. It's only really that one that's busy. But you can see from the traffic flow from the map that actually that's on the one-way system. So it's quite likely that all the buses coming in the morning, again, are going to go up that way. And again, without that map context, you don't really get that picture. So you can't see the full kind of capability of what's going on. So actually, by bringing the geography, you start to open up another layer as well. And obviously, looking at this, we can start to see, surprisingly, that when it gets to about 6 o'clock in the morning, everybody starts piling in for work normally. The number of available bikes drops, and again, it all runs along, and then slowly creeps back up through the day. And you can see the number of bike stands drops, obviously, during the working day as well, which is fairly fine. It's quite traditional in terms of dashboarding. But the last little bit at the bottom there is where we've got the embedded analytics. So that's where we're deriving a narrative based on the data, but we're also doing some forecasting. So the charts at the bottom are actually taking that average kind of bike usage across the sort of 3 years worth of data that we have. And then it's predicting out for us and saying, well, based on the current usage, we expect it's going to stay at this sort of level. So again, if you're looking at planning where you maybe need to move bikes around within the network, you can start to say, well, based on that, actually what I might want to do is have another action in here that lets me send a report into FME to say, well, actually, I need to move or allocate another 10 bikes to this particular location because we can see this is really busy, or it's predicted to be very busy because maybe we're coming into the summer season. So therefore, we know we're going to have more tourists coming in, at least maybe next year or later in this year. And therefore, put a work action in that's going to tell a system to basically get somebody to go out and move those bikes around. Because with a lot of these bike schemes, they'll place bikes to meet demand. And even though, because they'll know from their kind of patterns of usage where it's likely to get busy. So this just helps with that process flow as well. But by embedding those analytics into this report, makes it easy for somebody to actually start to see those patterns that are going on. And that's really kind of where it's coming from. It's to say, well, we can actually now start to embed some of that more intelligent analytics directly into the sort of FME reports that our users are generating all the time at the back of FME. They're probably a slightly more professional standard. I think they look a little bit nicer. They're a lot easier to interact with. They're a lot more dynamic, which I think people expect these days, as well as they go through. And it allows us to put that descriptive narrative and forecasting information in there as well to kind of enrich what those end users are actually seeing. But again, it's all being driven from off an FME workflow or an FME automation that's saying, well, if something happens or at this particular time of day, push this information out to these different types of users and groups as it runs through. And I think one thing we certainly noticed by putting some of this together was that, it's this post-workspace world. A lot of what we're talking about now is actually being driven by automations, especially when we're looking at drawing all these different systems up. It's no longer just a little workspace running in isolation or one huge monolithic workspace doing lots and lots of processing. what we've actually now got is lots of different workspaces doing lots of little different things, talking to other business systems, pulling data together. And automations are really what's allowing us to do that. And it's really them that are probably being, the power, at especially more of an enterprise level, where FME now sits. It's not just that little workspace on a desktop generating a little report. It's very much a bigger system running much more data, interact with many more systems in the cloud, locally, pulling that through, and then actually starting to take some of these intelligent decisions or allowing users to make these intelligent decisions. And really, that's what FME is providing. It's all of that back-end data management. It's all that, connecting to the sensors that are out there, bringing that data in to keep the data warehouses, data marts current, doing all the data integrity checking. It's the stuff that FME has been doing for years, does very, very well, works very, very effectively doing just behind the scenes a lot of the time. But also now with the new automations, it lets us do much more workflow orchestration. FME's always been able to do it, but it's always been quite tricky to get your head around and build up these more complex workflows. Automations really changes that, makes that very simple to start to connect these different systems together. Especially with little messages, we can pass information between blocks of workspaces, other business systems, pull them through, and really drive all of that integration as well. And certainly from the business intelligence side, the analytics, it means it's very, very easy now to pull those analytics either together to present into a dashboard, to use something like the machine learning, to do it as having users actually make decisions, pass it back into that orchestration workflow, or just pull the analytics in so that we can present it in a much more targeted and focused location for where somebody just needs to look at maybe just that one forecast piece of information. They want to know for a particular set of assets that they're responsible, maybe a particular set of bike stands they have in their particular postcode that they need to manage. They can start to see the forecast information and then start to make some of those decisions based on just those stands they're interested in.
Thanks for that, Gavin. So I guess to summarize that great presentation from Gavin, I know you put a lot of work in the background, so thank you for that, Gavin. FME, I suppose, provides that dynamic enterprise level ETL platform to address all business needs. I think it's very easy to look at FME only in a geospatial context, but hopefully today we showed you how you can kind of move up beyond spatial and its capabilities and strengths as an enterprise ETL platform. Snowflake, it was definitely an unsung hero, and we barely scraped the surface of its functionality and what it can do and what it can provide for an organization. But it is that single source of trusted data with governed access to help you scale on demand to be able to address the growing demand for enterprise data. And then Sisense, again, it's about turning that data into information. When we go back to that, my earlier slides, I'm talking about that wealth of information that's being created, wealth of data being created. That's great, but it's how do you then put that into a context for a user to make their life easier or a citizen's life easier? And again, that's where Sisense really comes in, with that ability to be able to fuse and embed that analytics to get those answers out to the people that need it first and foremost, to make, I suppose, informed decisions on what the next actions are. So if you'd like a free ride at our World Fair event, you can visit us on IMGS or www.imgs.ie, and from there you can get a free trial of FME desktop, server or cloud. Again, you can also get a free trial of Snowflake and Sisense. So if you do want to try what we showed today or elements of what we showed today, by all means jump onto our website and we'll arrange a free trial. Gavin and I are also happy to share any of the workspaces that we've built today. So again, if it is something that you want to try or elements of it you want to try today, don't be afraid to reach out to us. And if you do, you may be watching this as a pre-recorded video, so you might be able to jump into the live chat now next. But you can reach out to Gavin or myself with our email addresses up on screen, and we're happy to support you. Before I move to the Q&A, I just want to thank Safe Software. I think they've put on an amazing event. I know firsthand how complicated it is to orchestrate something of this size globally for partners and customers. And I just think absolutely amazing event. I just want to say well done to the team at Safe for being able to bring all this together. So we're going to pop over to the live chat now. So we'll see you shortly.